Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining today. This has been in the works for a while. This is a very big topic. So fire safety, suppression, prevention. It's a super, super deep topic. So we're only going to be able to kind of go high level today. And that's why afterwards we'll be sharing some additional information. Our guest today will also be sharing some additional information. So look out for that as a follow-up. To begin with, let's start by setting the scene. So we can kind of go one at a time, just a couple of minutes each. It'd be great for you to share your insight, opinion, and statistics on what we're seeing regarding battery fires at the moment. And Patrick, maybe let's start with you, because I was watching your YouTube channel earlier about all the kind of different things that you're talking about there. So Patrick, let's start with you.
Yeah, ultimately, we don't have a lot of good numbers for the amount of battery fires out there. And that's an area that's frustrating to me, because if you don't have good data, you just don't know how big or small that problem really is. I kind of break it into 3 different size scales, starting off with just small batteries. So your cell phone up to, smaller power tools and things like that, maybe up to a lawnmower sized. And you see stories out there, they're pretty frequent throughout the year of, kids sleeping with their cell phone or a power bank under their pillow and it catches on fire in the middle of the night, or some type of fire in a power tool. But some of this data we're not really tracking. And a lot of it, especially when you talk about tool batteries, for example, if a tool battery catches on fire on a construction site and the workers just kick it off to the side, a lot of times they're never calling the fire department, so we never know about that fire. So we it's an example of where we don't have good data in that area. And then when we get to electric vehicles, there's a lot of people concerned about electric vehicle fires, and they are happening, but we, at least in the U.S., don't have a good way of tracking EV fires and understanding how frequently they actually are happening. So it is a struggle, but when they do happen, especially on the EV side, it's a pretty big event. And then you scale that up one step further to battery energy storage systems, so grid scale energy storage. We're seeing about one of those per month if you look at last year. And when those do happen, they are large scale events depending on the structure. You look at some of the older systems. Moss Landing just happened probably about a month ago. Moss Landing, California. That was a significant fire. 1,200 megawatt hours of energy storage. And it's a big deal. And I believe the fire department's still on scene for that incident almost a month later. So incidents are happening. We just don't know how frequently.
Nice. Thank you, Patrick. Brian?
Yeah, sure. So Brian Morin, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Soteria Battery Innovation Group. And we did so I'm going to give kind of 2 perspectives on battery fires. One is we did a deep dive in e-bike fires because, it's a problem that's both big enough to be important and small enough that we as a small company could tackle it. And as part of this, I'll give 2 statistics. One is just looking in New York City, where they capture they capture the fires the best. They're having about 1 in 1,000 e-bikes catch fire. So roughly 250,000 e-bikes in New York City, and last year 277 e-bike fires. And so you're roughly 1 in 1,000. That's about 1,000 times more frequent than a cell phone will catch fire. So I joke, don't be afraid of your devices. You and 999,998 of your closest friends are all safe from your cell phones. But e-bikes is a little different. And then in a sort of a shocking development, we did, as part of our project, we polled over 1,000 e-bike riders and asked them a simple question: have you experienced a battery fire? And we were hoping to get a few people to say yes, right? Because 1 in 1,000 was kind of the number I came up with. 20% of them said they had experienced a battery fire. And so we had over 200 out of our 1,000-person survey say they'd experienced a battery fire. And the unfortunate thing is we didn't ask all the follow-up questions of, how big was it? When did it happen? Were you charging? Were you riding? Because we were hoping to get 1 or 2. We weren't hoping to get a statistically significant number. But it says that they're probably grossly underreported in any kind of reporting, that most of them don't make it to even the fire stations. They just get dealt with. But that was, so there. And then the other perspective I'll give, and I'll go really quick, is battery fires are different, and they're different for a couple reasons. One is they're unpredictable. You have in a neat little package both the ignition source and the fuel, and they'll just catch fire, right? You don't have to do something to it to ignite it. The second is it's immediate. There's no lead in of, you tip the candle over and it slowly catches fire and drifts its way over to the curtains. You don't have that minutes of lead in. It's immediate, and it's ferocious. They explode. And we use polite words like thermal runaway, but it's really an explosion if you watch it. And so in that sense, it's not so much the numbers as it is the intensity of each event also.
Oh, very good. I'll go next, I guess. Very good. Thanks. So Wayne Aho with Seimens here in the U.S. and Fire Protection or Fire Safety Division, Senior Product Manager for our detection products. So Seimens got involved with this and aspect from more of the fixed battery energy storage type of arrangements, right? The commercial ones we're used to seeing, containerized or room situations where the batteries are fixed. And some of the problems you were just talking about, Brian, I could see where, those scooters and e-bikes, they get abused, right? The batteries are vibrating, they get, charged and recharged and discharged deeply along the way. And those things can have a major impact on the health of the battery, right? The long-term life cycle of the batteries. So as Siemens got involved in this back in 2018, what we were finding was a large portion of the older batteries that have been in cycle for 4 or 5 years, and they were having these massive catastrophes in South Korea. So we get pulled in on a global basis from some battery manufacturers that were struggling with this. So we continue to do a great amount of research on those types of batteries. So larger battery modules and so forth from a fixed standpoint. And so aging is a concern, abuse conditions are a concern. We're seeing a lot of research across the globe beyond ourselves about other entities doing an amazing amount of research. And you probably see it yourselves, right? You just watch LinkedIn or watching any other energy storage sources in the industry. And we're really impressed with how many different organizations are involved. But we still have a ways to go, right? As Patrick just mentioned, Moss Landing just happened. And that's a very well-protected site, right? So it shows there's still work to do. We're all here, obviously, talking about this topic today, trying to spread the word to keep that going. And I think, then Brian, as you mentioned, it happens very quickly. So we're of the belief that detection is key. Right now, I'm seeing a lot of that in the different code cycles going around in different building codes and product safety codes. So that's good. But we still have a ways to go. I guess that's why I just leave with Jamie.
To continue, you all mentioned some really interesting statistics there about battery fires and frequencies. Patrick, in a real-world example, how do you categorize a battery fire? And then how do they compare to other types of fires when it comes to the volume, unpredictability, and ability to suppress?
The way I would prefer to categorize them is start off with charging and not charging. Are we seeing more fires when the device is charging, or are we seeing more fires when they're just sitting there idle? And one interesting and really surprising thing, going back to the New York City, FDNY found out it's like 57% of the devices weren't even charging at the time of the fire, which becomes a little concerning because at that point, how do you protect for something when the original guidance that was given was just be careful when you're charging them and monitor the charging activities. So that's a struggle. Then we also have to look at, was the battery the cause of the fire, or was it just part of, did you have a room and contents fire or a garage fire that caught the battery on fire? So there's two different things there when you start looking at the battery fire. So it's important to categorize that type of data to really understand where the issues are. When you start looking at the fires themselves, it all comes down to just the size of the fire. A cell phone is about 12 watt hours of power. It's not going to be a really aggressive fire. And typically, if one of those catches on fire, you're just catching other stuff in the room on fire very quickly. When you look at an e-bike, the whole room is catching on fire almost instantaneously because that battery there's a lot of energy stored inside of that battery. And then when you get to something the size of an electric vehicle, it's just that scale of fire growth. So that's where I have the concerns when you start looking at the failures.
For those listeners or viewers that weren't aware, so Brian actually was on the podcast at the back end of 2023 before your e-bike battery safety report was released. And you were talking through some shocking statistics there about kind of 1 in 1,000 e-bikes will catch fire in New York, which is just crazy. From what you're seeing, and Patrick will stick with you on this in terms of a real life example, are you seeing the rate of battery fires increasing or decreasing, and how do you see this trending in the future?
Honestly, I don't know if we're seeing an increasing or decreasing. If you look at the FDNY data, it seems like it's fairly consistent right now. I think Brian said 277 fires last year. I believe the year before was right around 265 fires. So when you look in the news and you look at, you're trying to skim the media for different events that happen across the U.S. or even across the world, it seems like we're seeing multiple events per week. But those are just the ones that are catastrophic and actually make the news. It's not the one where somebody had an e-bike catch on fire and like Brian said, it's completely unreported because they just shove it in their backyard or shove it in their driveway and, they spray the garden hose on it for a little bit and it's done. They don't ever report it. So it's hard to really know the frequency right now, but we know when it does happen, especially if it happens indoors or a high-rise apartment, the results can be deadly.
Brian, Wayne, anything to add on kind of trends at the moment?
Yeah, I'll chime in that the rate of fires, if you think of, the number of fires divided by the number of devices, probably isn't increasing, but the number of devices and the ways we're using them is increasing dramatically. We're replacing gas-powered lawn and garden tools, replacing, obviously gas-powered vehicles of all kinds, right? So, and I know anecdotally I have a bunch of stories, but we had a weed eater catch fire at a golf course near here, and it was in the shed with their 80 electric golf carts, and so they lost the shed, 80 golf carts overnight, right? And that's, you think about it, Patrick and Wayne know that if you have 80 golf carts catching fire, you've got flames shooting 50 feet air over the top of that building, right? So every golf course within several hundred miles knows this story and knows the people involved. And so, the rate probably isn't as batteries get better, but because the number of batteries is so much more, the number of fires is probably going up.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think also what's happening is there's more supply side, on the supply side of batteries, right? There's a greater number of battery manufacturers now. So even domestically, right, there's a number of battery plants that have been opened or are in the construction phase now here. So I think this, even though the percentage, we could all say, the percentage is somewhat low. If you put more of these, as Brian was just saying, we put more of these out in the fields and use them, we're going to have more problems. So that's really the challenge, I'd say, Jamie.
It's hard to track those numbers because, as you say, there's more batteries coming online and electrification of everything is happening. So it's difficult to track the percentages. But Brian, we'll get into this later, but something that was fascinating about your report was how easy it was to actually reduce the amount of battery fires. Just very, very simple fixes when it comes to how the battery packs are manufactured. So we'll get to that very soon. Wayne, I missed your talk in Detroit, Michigan, unfortunately at the battery show. I've heard it was very, very good. This is going to be super hard for you to do, but in a couple of minutes, kind of what were the main kind of takeaways and headlines from that talk you delivered?
Sure, I love a great challenge, Jamie. Thanks. Well, I had the pleasure of sharing the stage with Fire Marshal Donald Thomas from the city of Detroit, and we, similar to what we're doing here, we talked about the challenges. As you can imagine, Detroit, as we all know, is a city that's rebuilding itself, right? It's going through a massive renaissance, and it's doing a great job. It's much different than the last time I was there. I applaud them all for working as a community, including the manufacturing, right? We all know that's Motor City, right? They had a host of, not failing, but just aged businesses, right? So what they're doing is rebuilding, and now GM and Ford have started building battery plants there. They're doing a tremendous amount of research there. So there's a great challenge there, obviously, to protect all this new investment and what to do with all of this. So I applaud them all for being very active and very transparent as a group in that community to work together to address all of these things that we're talking about. You can imagine if you have a 200,000 square foot factory, right? And you're assembling and you're doing testing on batteries of various sizes, right? Think about EVs. They're not just one small little battery, right? They're a multitude of batteries put into a pack, and everything. I think I heard a statistic the other day that today's cars, whether it's EV or internal combustion engine cars, they're almost 70% plastic. The automobiles. So think about that as a fuel source, Patrick, right? As we mentioned, and Brian mentioned how explosive the batteries can be, and suddenly everything that's consumable is engulfed. So Donald and I went through the best way of protecting yourselves from these types of things, and it's early warning, right? We're both big believers in detecting the situation early in the stages, right? So what we could call is the incipient stage of the fire, overheating. If the batteries are getting overcharged or they go deep discharge and then they start to fail internally, they're going to get hot, right? So those types of things we discussed at length, and then how we went on to talk about building codes and so forth, how they're addressing these things, the challenges. But that's what we boiled it down to. If you can get to it early enough, it gives you the best chance, right, before that explosion occurs, right, to intervene. And now it can be hard to do, right? If you're in a 200,000 square foot factory and you have a battery on a rack, right, that starts to overheat, that's a bigger challenge than, say, your scooter starts to overheat and smoke a little bit. You roll it out of your house, as we mentioned, right? You roll that out. So you can see it's a different scale, right? The problem is a different scale, but it's the same problem. That's what we're finding. These batteries just have that innate ability to generate their own oxygen, and they have flammable material within them. So it gets to be quite challenging to deal with. But Detroit has it in a big scale right now because of the size of these factories. So it was a very informative session. I think the crowd enjoyed it. We got some great Q&A on the end. So I suspect we'll get some good questions here today too.
And just on that point, of course, you've been focusing on fire suppression for a while, and that's your focus at Seimens. What advancements have you seen in recent years when it comes to this technology, and what advancements do you see?
Well, I think there's so much research going on now, but the packaging of the batteries will lead us in different directions with these things, right? With the detection. There'll be smaller sensors I see in the future that will actually maybe be built into the battery packs for, the larger ESS type battery modules, which are like the size of a bread box, right? If anybody remembers what a bread box is. Now I'm dating myself. But, good sized rack mounted batteries, you can put sensors inside of those. They haven't been doing that, but that's something you could do. But we're also looking at removing ambient oxygen from a certain amount of it, because we've done a fair amount of research where if you limit that available oxygen source, right, to that fire, as we talked about earlier, the fires can start on their own, right, within the battery. And then the battery has consumable materials within it, right, flammable materials. And then if you feed that process with ambient oxygen, it just makes it explosive, as Brian mentioned, right? Well, we're finding in our research that if you can limit that oxygen supply, it actually does some it limits the heat spread. So that's a big function of this. So you don't get the adjacent batteries or battery modules involved. and depending on the battery technology, right? We have cylindrical batteries, we have pouch batteries, and then we have more containerized batteries. And so it's different. Each one of those packages has its own challenge. So really, my advice is you really need to know what batteries you're dealing with to develop your solution.
I'm sure there'll be some good questions for you at the end on that. Imagine one of them will be, what is a bread box? Potentially. I'm just guessing. Nice one. Thank you. And Brian, I mentioned before, obviously on the podcast back in 2023, the piece of research hadn't been out. It hadn't been finished. It wasn't released. So again, kind of talk us through some of the kind of main takeaways and headlines from that report.
Yeah. So the main takeaways, if I give you the sense, the challenge today with small devices, and e-bikes are just an example of the small devices, is that you have people who are passionate about the application of the device, and what they want is a box with some energy in it that they can trust, and they're just asking a supplier, can you deliver me a box with some energy that I can trust? And the supplier says, yes, of course, safety is very important to us, and they don't think about the design inside of there. And the challenge is that there's a lot of simple things that can be done to improve the safety of small devices, so bigger than cell phones but smaller than EVs, that are not being done. And it's things like there's a system called thermal propagation resistance, which essentially says if one cell catches fire, it's not going to ignite all the other cells. And so in an e-bike, you have about 50 cells, each of which is the size of a cell phone battery. If one of them goes off, like Patrick said, it's not a big deal if you prevent the other 49 from going off. If they all go off, then the room's ignited and get out, right? Because you don't need to breathe that stuff. And so passive propagation resistance that prevents the propagation prevents cell-to-cell propagation is relatively easy to do. It's well known, but not implemented. We took apart about 30 e-bike batteries. It was not implemented in a single e-bike battery that we took apart, nor have we found any reports online or anything of it being implemented. So we're putting out a standard which requires passive propagation resistance. Another thing that's not done is any kind of thermal control. And I'll say for those of you who are new to batteries or not deeply familiar with batteries, in general use, the two things you can do to make a battery fire far more likely is to charge cold or discharge hot. Right, so if your battery's hot and you've charged and discharged your power tools or your leaf blowers a couple times, that hot discharge is going to leave it in an over-discharged state, and that over-discharged state is going to cause the copper to kind of wander around inside the battery and land where it wants to, and that's not what you want. That's going to make a battery fire far more likely. And the same thing, if you charge when it's cold, the lithium is going to land where you don't want it. And again, it's going to create kind of metal in places that you don't want metal on the inside of the battery, which makes the fire more likely. But it's these simple things that aren't being done that we're going to try to educate the market, set a standard that if people want to reach the standard, they can display that they've met a very high standard. But then the thing to say is, Soteria, small company, we're tackling batteries that you can tuck under your arm. I'm really glad to have companies like Seimens who have 1,000 engineers for every one we have to tackle the really big systems. And then the same thing, the engineers at Tesla and Ford and GM and all the other automotive companies, those systems are so much more sophisticated than what we're getting in our small devices. So there's a critical problem now in the small devices. That's what we're addressing. Obviously, the size of the problem is much bigger with your really big energy storage, so it's a very different system, but it requires more sophistication than we have to be able to tackle that, right?
Yeah, some great work going on the whole panel here, so thank you all very much. Before we get into the Q&A section, I just wanted to have some kind of final statements from the three of you. Patrick, for you, what is the main message or I guess piece of advice that you'd like to highlight to firefighters out there?
Biggest thing for firefighters is to get educated on batteries. There's a lot of misinformation and lack of understanding around batteries and battery fires. But I do have a message just for kind of to go off of what Brian was saying as well. There's also a lot of really cheap batteries being sold out there that shouldn't be purchased. And when you look at, I can buy a brand name tool battery for $120, or I can buy 6 knockoff batteries for $50. A lot of consumers are making that choice. And I think that leads to a lot of fires. And the thing that really scares me is you look at on YouTube at all the instructions out there. You talk about people having a passion for their devices and wanting energy, that just build their own homemade battery for an e-bike or some type of device. And that's pretty scary when you look at it and what they're, sticking between their legs to ride down the road.
And Brian and Wayne, similar question, but main messages and advice for battery manufacturers out there. Wayne, let's start with you.
Well, we've been working with a number of them ourselves and helping them understand. Not only do they have the basic, let's say, basic hygiene of working within building codes and fire codes, right, that exist for the municipality that they happen to be in. As we all know, many of these sites are built out in the wide open spaces, right? Some people don't want that, not in my backyard, right? There's a lot of that going on, which is fine. That's quite understandable. But following those basic building blocks, but then also having good fire protection resources, designers to evaluate what I've seen, my own personal, every process is slightly different. They follow overall at a very high level the same type of process because the batteries are not that different, but their manufacturing processes are different. And they each try to make it unique to themselves and maybe squeak on a little more capacity versus the next guy. But doing those types of things leads you into uncharted waters. So start with the basic building blocks of our building codes and fire codes, right? But then also do your own homework and do testing on where are those points within my process that I may have problems. Right? They learn, but you don't want to learn after the fact, right? You want to learn while you're developing it, because then it's easier to make those modifications or even small modifications and introduce possibly sensors and or agents to help solve those problems when you encounter them. So there's not a major evacuation of hundreds of workers out of a factory. It's something small, and that you can handle it, you're prepared for it, and you can address it. Because if the fire truck pulls up, right, that fires what had been burning for several minutes. As we talked, as Brian mentioned, these fires are explosive. If you have more flammable materials nearby, right, or other batteries, it's just going to grow in nature. So you need to take care of your process and understand it fully. So that's the experience we've had, and we've been helping folks do that. So it's exciting, but some that are not doing it, I think those will, or have not done it, maybe the ones that end up on the 6 o'clock news, right? And that's unfortunate. We'd like to see everybody avoid that.
Definitely. Need to keep it out of the news as much as possible. That's for sure. And Brian?
Yeah, so we always talk about safety as a system. So think about, for cars, you had lap belt, shoulder harness, airbags, anti-lock brakes, crumple zone, bumpers, radar, lane keeping, all of which keeps us mechanically safe in the car. For batteries, it's going to be the same thing. You're going to have a system of different strategies to keep the battery safe. If anybody says they have a silver bullet, that this is the one thing that's going to make a battery safe, it's not true. You're putting a lot of energy in a small package. It's going to come out. You're going to need a system to keep it in there. And so now I'll give a short plug for the Soteria Consortium. This is a group of companies, some of which have safety systems of their own. And we promote kind of an open level, mature dialogue around safety. We promote products that are not our own and try to get them into kind of the public eye. So if you're and the other thing is I get to see a fantastic number of new strategies, whether they're sensors or enclosures or other ways to prevent fires or mitigate them. And so if you're a designer or a company that's using batteries, this is one way to learn a lot about what's kind of at the cutting edge, is to jump into our consortium. So we welcome everybody. It's open, and we try to create an open dialogue around battery safety.
Nice. Thank you, Brian. Well, yeah, thank you all. We're now on the Q&A section. So I'm going to jump into the questions that have been asked. The first one is for Wayne. It is, what is a bread box? It's not
Did you put that one on, Jerry?
I did. I couldn't help myself. No, seriously. So, yeah, there's a good one here. What is the best way to detect a battery fire?
As early as possible is what we were saying, right, earlier. And so there's a lot of ways. But again, depending on your battery that you're what are you actually trying to detect? What type of battery? Is it a big battery module that's the size of a bread box, which has a lot of energy in it and would develop a great amount of heat that would be relatively easily detected? Or is it a small 18650 battery that wouldn't be so easy to detect? So that's where you have to determine what's your target detection size, I guess. And then that'll drive what you will do for. There's a lot of choices in detection, right? You can do very early warning smoke detection. You can do gas detection, but the gas is later in the stage, right? If we were to look at the cycle, right, the batteries are overheating first before they vent out their gas, right? And so that if you get to the vent stage, you're kind of almost too late, because your thermal runaway is going to happen very shortly after that. And our research has been seconds to, I say, a couple of minutes, right? So it depends on what type of size and the package of the battery you're looking at. So gas detection has gotten to be very popular, but that's more for ventilation and try to stop larger explosions from occurring. So I would say incipient sources or very close monitoring with your battery monitoring system, right? The battery monitoring system, the BMS as it's known. That's really the heart of this situation now, right? If you have a large installation of batteries, you have to supervise them and really know what's going on with them. For detection, thermo monitoring is getting to be popular, but again, it's a combination of all these tools in our toolbox.
I'll jump in with an additional one. And this is a technology that was developed by Kinetic, so it's a large British defense contracting company. And Soteria is licensing it, and then we'll make it available to others. But you coat the outside of the battery with a coating that will volatilize when that outside of the battery, the case gets to a certain temperature, so say 50, 60, 70 degrees C, and then when it volatilizes, it's detectable. So it's a way to detect temperature, which is what Wayne had said, but to do it all over the battery without running thermocouples everywhere. As soon as one part of the battery gets hot, you detect the gas, and then you can turn on your cooling system.
Another one here. What challenges and opportunities do you see in using second life batteries for stationary energy storage?
The challenge at the cell level is you don't know the history of that battery. And I had talked about cold charge and hot discharge. There's no way to tell which cells have been charged cold or discharged hot to know what's going on inside the batteries. So I'm a fan of recycling. Wayne, you can give the system level discussion.
Yeah, no, I would agree. They're getting to be very popular now to take an EV battery module, right, and put them into an enclosure and put it out at a solar farm or a wind farm, because they have incredible capacity, right? Battery, they call them traction batteries, right? That's the industry term for those types of batteries. But again, being able to store that much energy, they're a bigger risk. And being aged, and when we say aged, they're not capable of holding the capacity you need for a 300 or 400 mile range in the vehicle, right? But for what I would call softer charging type and discharging type applications of solar, right, which is up and down, is not usually a full-on charging type of arrangement where you could get overcharging, right? It's much more a slower charge, let's say. Those they're good there, but again, as Brian mentioned, you don't know the history, and you don't know what those battery module may have for inherent defects. So you definitely want to protect yourself there. And what I'm seeing is a lot of containment. So that passive fire protection practices, right? You contain them. So they're already in a battery module, but then you put them in a nice small containerized, so you limit your potential damage. And that's been a philosophy. Again, passive fire protection means been available to us for over 100 years, right? In the industry and in our societies. So I think that helps when, you know, to maintain a reasonable size of battery and not allow this to burn the whole, let's say, solar farm down. Right? You have one containerized that's instrumented so you can get some people, some attention there to help and limit the damage so that the first responders that come, they don't have to deal with a catastrophe. They're just dealing with further containment, right, by keeping things wet and cool that are nearby.
So one area I see it's really concerning in that same size, you're focused on grid storage. I've seen a lot of people taking automotive battery modules and making their home energy storage out of it as well. So they're just mounting these to the wall and there's no type of enclosure whatsoever. Could even be in their basement. So I think about fires involving that, no containment, no suppression, firefighters having to go down in those areas to fight that fire, may not even know what they're getting themselves into. So there's a tremendous amount of concern on second-use batteries when it comes to do-it-yourself type projects.
I would agree with you there, Patrick, 100%. That's not where a DIYer should be going. Right, with these types of batteries. The capacity is just too great and the dangers are too high, and they're doing it unknowingly, unfortunately.
We've got a question from Chuck. For large-scale batteries, are the manufacturers considering onboard fire detection and suppression as part of their battery skids?
I've heard of many that have been publicly announced, so I think if you did a search, you would see, I think, not to name, I'm not going to name names, but I know I've seen one major manufacturer put out something that was in conjunction with the battery, an EV manufacturer, that they were developing sensors that go inside of the battery modules. So yeah, you would think that they would want to do that, because if you're driving down the highway on your car at 65, 70 miles an hour and it starts to burn, you probably want to get out of it long before it starts to burn.
There's a company, Lion Tamer. It's Lion, so a little play there. But Lion Tamer and their technology has been licensed by Honeywell. Those are sensors designed for energy storage facilities to give advanced warning for battery fires. They detect the vent event, which, like Wayne says, is sort of a secondary event, so it comes after heating.
We have a relationship with that company, and it is later down the track, as you say, Brian, the venting portion, so it doesn't do as good as the incipient type detection. Just to be full disclosure, you have to just keep that cycle in mind where you're trying to do your detection.
Wayne, we've got someone here asking to cover a little bit more on suppression. So we don't know, I've asked if they have a specific question, but is there any kind of more of your favorite areas about suppression that you want to talk about?
Well, it all depends about your application, right? If it's a scooter burning in your apartment in New York City, what are you going to have at your disposal, right? A glass of water, or you really need to remove the fire from that type of, or you could smother it possibly, but that's not going to stop it. So suppression at a high level is our choice has been inerting, as I mentioned to you earlier in our talk here. If you can reduce the amount of ambient oxygen in the space, it does reduce the amount of damage that the batteries can do. And we've proven that and got a product listing for it, the only one that we're aware of, that will stop, as Brian mentioned earlier, the propagation, right? So your first cell, you're going to have an issue, and there's not a lot that you can do about, you're not going to stop that process in that initial cell. But the success of any method is going to be from stopping that propagation from that first cell to the others, because that's where the catastrophes start, right? When you're building up that heat rapidly and then transferring it to the next piece of flammable material next door. So Brian did a good job of explaining it too earlier about transport time, right? It's not like a candle knocked over and then the flame slowly made its way across some other piece of flammable material, made it to the curtains, and now the room is on fire. Fires today, especially with all the man-made materials in the built environment, they go rapidly, right? So you really have to take that into account. I know most of us don't think about this, right? But years ago, you had about 17 minutes to evacuate your home in a residential fire, right? Or a typical fire that would happen. Now, the latest study suggests that it's more like 3 to 5 minutes, that you have to evacuate. So assume you're sleeping and you're charging your scooter down to your living room, right? And now so that scooter goes up, your smoke detectors or smoke alarms will pick it up. But now you only have a couple of minutes to get out of there. You have to wake up, right, and get out of the building. So you can see the risk here. The risk is increased greatly. So obviously suppression systems that we would sell don't typically get put into homes, right? So that's why, as we were saying earlier, this is a multifaceted challenge, right? Because these batteries are going everywhere. So for large-scale battery storage, we are finding inerting early detection, and then inerting stops the initial problem from becoming a big disaster. That's our practice, and we've been doing that since 2019.
Oh, there's a bit of dialogue here. So Chuck, thank you, Wayne. Are the manufacturers also considering rapid discharge drains to discard the stored energy in case of emergency?
I've not heard that, but that's interesting. That would be impressive to see if you could take a couple of megawatts of energy and take that down out of the batteries that rapidly. I really would like to see that. It's a good premise. I could see where it could be very helpful.
Closest I've seen that is salt water. Using salt water to create shorts on the inside of the battery, which also cool it down. So draining the energy and turning, essentially you use the energy of the battery to steam the salt water.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it takes a long time though. That's it. That's the downside. You're talking 24-ish, 48 hours.
What are the best methods for bulk storage of end-of-life batteries, all types, and what relevant codes need to be met in a recycling factory?
I think there's a lot of challenges in this area, and this is an area that I've got a lot of concerns in a lot of areas, but NFPA 855 does talk about bulk storage of end-of-life lithium-ion batteries, and it talks about managing the pile size, so the amount of batteries you have in one location, the size of the rooms, the suppression, the detection. But overall, I think we are still learning in this area, and I don't think we have a good method for bulk storage or for bulk transportation of end-of-life lithium-ion batteries. There have been a number of trailers that have either caught on fire or flat out exploded, deflagrated. Some as minor as blowing the back door off of the tractor or the trailer that's being hauled by the semi-truck. Some where it's a catastrophic failure where it looks like a flatbed trailer after the event is over. If you look at Birmingham, Alabama, that was a great example of a major disaster. There was one in, I believe it was Austin, Texas, where it was a shipping container that exploded and completely removed the walls and the ceiling off of the shipping container. So I've got a lot of concern in that area. We need to figure out a better way of shipping these batteries because we've got good standards around DDR batteries, damaged, defective, recall batteries. I say we've got good standards. I think there's still some room for improvement, but we do have standards there. But when you take end-of-life batteries and you just throw them in a 55-gallon drum or a large Gaylord box, they might not be damaged when they went in there. They might just have been end-of-life batteries at that point. But now they've got all the weight of the other battery cells on them. You've got the road vibration, moving those containers around. Now you have damaged batteries in that box, and that can lead to a failure. So there's a lot of concerns all around in that area.
Nice. And one final question, and this is an interesting one because it's more around some costs. So Sean asks, how are you evaluating codes and standards to keep incremental costs down and required maintenance low to prevent an increase in cheap and unsafe alternatives?
Yeah, I think the code, obviously, this codes and standards environment, right? We're on a 3-year cycle. I think every 3 years we've seen improvement. So if you look back 10 years ago, I think IBC and IFC were rather quiet on lithium ion batteries specifically, right? There was not a lot in there. But if you look in today, there's quite a bit more in there. So that's, it's an evolution, right? And it's consensus based. So, the committees work very, very hard to do this. And then the research has to catch up, right? As I always say, I think when we first joined the call, it's very impressive with all the research that's going on from all sources. So if you feel you need information, I think you might be able to find it about the particular battery. And a lot of the battery manufacturers know that they need to supply much of this information now. So I think the codes are catching up. You're in a much better place than you were. Does that mean we're done? No, I think we're far from done. I think Patrick would, as he's been saying, we have a ways to go. So I would agree with that.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for today. And thank you for all the good work that you do. And I mean, obviously, there's been a huge amount of growth in this area, and we're seeing a lot of activity across North America. And, there can be more batteries out there, whether people like it or not. And it's super important that we keep each other safe whilst doing this and identifying ways to prevent fires, suppress them. Obviously, education to firefighters, it's critical work. So this is a webinar about the future, and hopefully, with the work of you three gentlemen and thousands of others in the industry, we can be working towards safer batteries. So, gentlemen, thank you very much.